Formula One is facing a crisis so serious that drivers are now openly accusing the FIA of creating dangerous cars, and then punishing them for trying to survive them. After Miami, multiple champions exploded behind closed doors. One driver lost positions hours after the race ended. Another crash forced emergency rule changes. And now, the FIA has launched even more investigations while secretly rewriting regulations race by race just to stop the chaos from getting worse. But the part nobody expected is that teams believe the fixes only solve 20% of the problem. That means the real disaster may still be coming. Because what happened in Miami was not just about penalties. It exposed something much bigger hiding inside Formula One. A system so unstable, drivers say they are no longer racing the car, they are fighting the battery, the software, and the rules themselves. And with Canada approaching, the entire sport could be heading toward the biggest confrontation between drivers and the FIA in years. Subscribe now, because this story becomes far more disturbing once you see what the FIA changed in secret after the Behrman crash. Miami was supposed to calm the situation. Instead, it became the race weekend that exposed how deep the crisis inside Formula One really is. Because the moment the checkered flag dropped, the paddock exploded. Charles Leclerc was hit with one of the most controversial penalties of the entire season after repeatedly cutting the same chicane while defending position late in the race. The FIA said he gained an illegal advantage. Ferrari argued the car had mechanical problems turning right. But the stewards rejected the explanation and handed Leclerc a brutal 20-second penalty after the race had already finished. And that instantly created outrage. Not just because of the punishment itself, but because Leclerc crossed the line believing he finished 6th, only to lose 2 positions hours later while fans were already leaving the circuit. For the drivers, that changes everything. Because in their eyes, Formula One is becoming impossible to predict. One moment you survive the race. The next moment, the result disappears. And Leclerc was not the only one under investigation. Max Verstappen also received a penalty for repeated track limits violations during the race. Smaller punishment, less dramatic outcome. But together the incidents revealed a pattern drivers had already been warning about since the opening round of the season. The new 2026 regulations are making the cars harder to control in critical moments, especially during energy recovery phases. Now, that sounds technical. But imagine this. You are sprinting at full speed, and suddenly somebody grabs your backpack from behind for half a second. That tiny interruption completely changes your balance. That is what drivers say these cars feel like under heavy braking when the battery systems suddenly shift power delivery. And this is where the story becomes much more serious than simple penalties. Because drivers believe the FIA created a system that increases mistakes, then punishes drivers for making those mistakes. That is why frustration inside the paddock has reached levels nobody expected this early in the new regulation era. And behind closed doors, several drivers were already warning the FIA that something worse was coming long before Miami even started. The tension inside Formula One did not begin in Miami. Miami was simply the moment everything exploded in public. Because weeks earlier, some of the biggest names in the sport were already attacking the new regulations with language drivers almost never use against the FIA. Max Verstappen called the new system anti-racing. He even compared Formula One to Formula E, arguing that battery management had become more important than pure driving. And when Verstappen speaks that directly, the paddock listens. Then Lando Norris added even more pressure. He described the racing as artificial, chaotic, and dangerous. That word matters. Dangerous. Because drivers complain about regulations all the time. That is normal in Formula One. But accusing the rules themselves of creating danger is completely different. And suddenly, more drivers started joining the rebellion. Lewis Hamilton said Formula One drivers should be attacking corners, not constantly managing battery systems. Fernando Alonso openly questioned whether fans even wanted this version of the sport. Carlos Sainz warned the repeated failures were becoming unacceptable. At first, the FIA appeared calm. The criticism sounded manageable, almost political. But then Japan changed everything. Oliver Behrman suffered a terrifying high-speed crash after a sudden power loss linked to the new energy systems. And that single accident completely transformed the conversation inside the paddock. Before Japan, drivers were arguing about entertainment. After Japan, they were arguing about survival. Because the problem with these new systems is not only speed. It is unpredictability. Drivers behind cannot always anticipate when another car will suddenly lose power during energy recovery phases. And at Formula One speeds, even half a second of confusion can become catastrophic. Think about driving on a highway at night. Now imagine the car directly in front of you suddenly slowing down without brake lights. That tiny moment of hesitation is enough to create disaster. That is exactly why the FIA started rushing emergency measures into the regulations after Japan. And this is where the story becomes even more revealing. The FIA did not just tweak small settings. They introduced one of the largest mid-season regulatory intervention packages Formula One has seen in decades. Which quietly tells you something important. Behind closed doors, the FIA may be far more worried than they are admitting publicly. The changes the FIA introduced after Miami were not small adjustments. They were emergency reactions. And once you look at them closely, a disturbing pattern starts to appear. Because nearly every new rule targets the exact same hidden problem. Cars suddenly losing performance in unpredictable moments. The FIA reduced maximum energy recovery during qualifying to stop batteries from charging and draining too aggressively. Then they increased charging power itself, trying to shorten the dangerous periods where drivers lose straight-line speed while the system recovers energy. But the biggest warning sign came from one specific rule change. The FIA massively reduced the maximum race boost available during overtaking situations. Now, on paper, that sounds harmless. But here is what it actually means. Before Miami, one car could suddenly gain an enormous speed advantage when battery boost activated. In some situations, the speed difference reached nearly 50 kilometers per hour. 50. In Formula One, that is terrifying. Imagine two cyclists riding side by side, then one suddenly gets launched forward by a motorcycle. That is how violent the speed changes were becoming. And according to multiple teams, drivers could not always predict when those shifts would happen. That is what made the situation dangerous. Especially in braking zones. Especially in traffic. Especially during overtakes. And suddenly, another hidden problem started appearing. Cars were becoming almost stationary on race starts. Because the energy systems occasionally failed to deliver enough power when the lights went out. Now imagine 20 Formula One cars accelerating toward turn 1, while one of them barely moves. That is not strategy anymore. That is a potential disaster. So the FIA created a completely new monitoring system that automatically detects weak launches and intervenes electronically if acceleration drops too low. But here's the part almost nobody is talking about. The FIA also introduced flashing warning lights to alert drivers behind when another car suddenly loses power. And that single detail changes the entire tone of this story. Because Formula One normally develops systems to make cars faster. Now they are developing systems to warn drivers that the car ahead may unexpectedly become dangerous. That is a completely different kind of problem. And despite all these emergency measures, teams still believe the FIA has only fixed a small fraction of the real issue. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if the regulations themselves are fundamentally broken? Because according to several drivers, the biggest issue is no longer penalties, batteries, or software. It is that Formula One no longer feels like pure racing. And Canada may push that frustration to its absolute limit. Canada is now becoming the race everybody inside Formula One fears. Not because of the weather. Not because of the walls. But because Montreal may expose whether the FIA actually solved anything at all. And the terrifying part is that the circuit itself could make the entire situation worse. The Gilles-Villeneuve circuit has long straights, brutal braking zones, and heavy acceleration areas that put enormous stress on the new energy systems. Which means one thing. The exact problem drivers have been complaining about all season, sudden power shifts, becomes even more extreme there. And the FIA knows it. That is why officials are already preparing stricter energy limits specifically for Canada. But here's where the pressure becomes almost impossible to contain. Drivers no longer believe these are isolated problems. They believe the philosophy behind the regulations itself is flawed. Because the more the FIA tries to fix the system, the more complicated the system becomes. New software. New emergency overrides. New battery restrictions. New safety warnings. New intervention systems. At some point, drivers started asking a question nobody inside Formula One wanted to hear. Are they still driving racing cars, or are they managing electronic survival systems at 300 kilometers per hour? And this frustration has now created open distrust between drivers and the FIA. Especially after Miami. Because many drivers believe the stewards are applying penalties inconsistently. One incident gets punished aggressively. Another receives almost nothing. The Alex Albon sprint incident became a perfect example. McLaren reportedly chose not to push for punishment after the situation was judged unintentional, while other cases received immediate penalties. That inconsistency is driving the paddock insane. Because drivers feel the outcome sometimes depends less on the rule itself, and more on interpretation, politics, or timing. And when trust disappears between drivers and officials, Formula One becomes extremely unstable. But there is another layer underneath all of this that makes the situation even more dangerous. The FIA publicly described the Miami changes as successful. Yet teams reportedly believe only around 20% of the problem has actually been solved. 20%. That means 80% still remains. And according to people inside the paddock, the real issue cannot be fixed with software updates or emergency restrictions. Because the deeper problem is the balance of the entire regulation concept itself. Drivers say they spend too much time thinking about batteries, charging cycles, and energy deployment instead of pushing the car to the limit. And that completely changes the DNA of Formula One. For decades, the sport was built around instinct. Braking later. Attacking harder. Finding the limit. Now drivers describe situations where they are actively forced to back away from racing instincts just to protect the energy system from collapsing at the wrong moment. And this is why the anger inside the paddock has become so personal. Because many drivers believe they are being blamed for problems they never created. The FIA writes the regulations. The teams build around them. The drivers adapt the best they can. Then when the cars become unstable, unpredictable, or dangerous, the drivers are the ones investigated, penalized, and criticized publicly. That is the contradiction fueling this entire rebellion. And if Canada produces another major controversy, the relationship between the FIA and the drivers may reach a breaking point that Formula One has not seen in years. And that leads to the biggest question hanging over Formula One right now. What happens if the drivers stop believing in the system completely? Because this is no longer just frustration. It is turning into resistance. Quietly at first. Then publicly. And now, almost impossible to hide. After Miami, several drivers reportedly pushed much harder behind closed doors for larger changes than the FIA was willing to admit publicly. Max Verstappen dismissed the Miami fixes as little more than a tickle, saying the sport needed much bigger changes. And when the reigning champion speaks that bluntly, people inside Formula One understand something important immediately. The trust is disappearing. Because drivers are starting to feel trapped between two impossible choices. Push the car to the limit and risk penalties, instability, or dangerous power loss. Or drive conservatively and stop racing the way Formula One was built to race. That is the real conflict underneath everything. And honestly, the FIA may have underestimated how emotional this battle would become. Because for drivers, this is not just about regulations. It is about identity. Formula One drivers spend their entire lives training themselves to attack corners instinctively. To trust the car. To react naturally at impossible speeds. Now many of them feel they are constantly second-guessing software behavior, battery deployment, and sudden energy drops instead of focusing purely on racing. Imagine asking a world-class boxer to stop thinking about punches, and instead think about conserving battery power every few seconds during the fight. Eventually, instinct disappears. And once instinct disappears in Formula One, confidence disappears too. That is why the reactions after Miami felt so unusually intense. Not staged. Not political. Personal. Because underneath every complaint about penalties or track limits, there is a deeper fear growing inside the paddock. That the sport itself is drifting away from what made people fall in love with it in the first place. And here's the part that should worry the FIA most of all. The drivers are not isolated anymore. Fans are starting to notice it too. People are seeing races where drivers suddenly slow down unpredictably. Cars behaving strangely in braking zones. Drivers talking more about battery percentages than overtaking opportunities. And once fans begin questioning the product itself, the pressure becomes dangerous for Formula One leadership. That is why Canada matters so much. Not because one race can destroy the season, but because another major controversy could turn private frustration into full public confrontation. Especially if more penalties arrive. Especially if another dangerous incident happens. Especially if drivers feel ignored again. Because right now, the FIA is trying to solve a structural problem with temporary patches. And temporary patches only work until the next crisis arrives. That is why so many people inside the paddock believe the real solution is being delayed until the 2027 regulations. But there is a terrifying possibility hidden inside that timeline. What if Formula One cannot wait that long? Because the deeper truth behind Miami is not that the FIA made mistakes. Every governing body makes mistakes. The real danger is that Formula One may have entered a regulation era where the drivers themselves no longer fully trust the cars beneath them. And in a sport measured in milliseconds, trust is everything. Once that disappears, the consequences can become impossible to control. Which is exactly why the next few races may define the future of this entire Formula One era.